Episode 3 of the Americas is called The Wild West, and it's about the sort of western part of America, which covers quite a large area. The majority of America is actually featured in this episode. So this episode starts off in Yellowstone, which is, probably the most famous part of the Wild West, if you know what I mean. And here we get a lot of great shots of Yellowstone. I mean, it's in the snow, it just looks amazing. But here we see coyotes. We basically just see a coyote looking for food. It's kind of alright. I mean, the main part is when he's fishing in this little river. He's trying to steal some fish from some otters, which is quite funny. You actually realise how big the otters are compared to the coyote. You'd think a coyote could easily take an otter, but actually they're not that much smaller than them. And they also live in groups, so it's not that easy to take them on. But it does manage to catch a trout from this river, which is fine. I think overall the filmmaking there was great. It looked great. What was actually going on was all right. It didn't feel like it was anything I hadn't really seen before. But no, it was still good. Then we go further south. I think we go to Colorado, where we see all these rattlesnakes emerging in the spring. That was really good. And it's one of the parts of the series, at least so far, that I didn't feel like I'd seen before. All the rattlesnakes emerging was cool, but there was this one female that has to wait behind because she's pregnant, she hasn't had her young yet, so she has to stay there in the rocks to give birth. And actually watching the rattlesnake give birth was really cool. I'd never seen that before. I think whenever you've seen rattlesnakes before, it's always them hunting. You don't really get too much else from them. And as Tom Hanks says at the start of that sequence, he did kind of call them the villains of the Wild West. And that's interesting because rattlesnakes are never really portrayed as the good guys in any sort of medium. In fact, when they usually pop up in films or in series, they're usually bad news for something. So I think it was interesting to show a more tender side of them. I kind of suspected they might give birth to live young, but I didn't really know for sure. And it was really interesting watching these little rattlesnakes take their first breaths. It was quite cool. And what was really impressive was the fact that this female basically starves herself for 20 months while she's pregnant in order to give birth and then to kind of stay with her young. That was just fascinating. I had no clue about that. So yeah, that was a really good sequence and probably the best part of the series so far for me. And then we go to California, we see acorn woodpeckers. They basically store their acorns in trees, but because there's a lot of farmland in there, they basically start storing them in barns, which isn't as handy because they're not as thick. Basically, they're knocking out all the bits of plywood and all the acorns are landing on the ground anyway. What I think was interesting about that sequence was that it was portrayed very comedically. Whereas I think there's a bit more of a serious story going on there and how the habitat's been destroyed and they're having to use these buildings to store their acorns, but it's not working out, so it's really not great for the woodpeckers. I found it interesting that we didn't go that route, to be honest. And then we go to the Sonoran Desert, where we see ants. So the ant sequence was very cool. They hold off on letting you know what kind of ants these are because that's kind of a giveaway for what's going on here. We basically see all these worker ants going out, collecting food, bringing them back to the colony, and there's all these ants that are hanging from the ceiling with massive abdomens that are full of nectar and water that the ants are feeding them, and this is why they're called honeypot ants. So I had heard of these before, I knew about them, but that was really cool. Again, I'd never seen it filmed in such detail. So it was really interesting. Again, it felt like something out of a sci-fi film. It did feel very extraterrestrial, which is what they were going for. And there's some ants with wings that'll fly off and start new colonies, but they have to wait for the water to come before they're able to do that. So it's really interesting watching the ants actually prep them for flight, like the worker ants are doing little pre-flight checks for them. That's quite interesting. I had no clue about that. I think the sequence gave you a very intimate view of the ants' lives, whereas I don't think we've ever had that before, and that was really cool. There's also bobcats in the desert as well. It was basically this really scabby looking bobcat going out to collect food for her cubs. And it was fine. It was nothing compared to the ants. It does kind of bounce between the two sequences. The ants were definitely the more interesting part of that. But the bobcat was also fine, so yeah, I like that as well. And then we move on to the Dust Bowl of America, the Great Plains. And here we see a lot of storms. I think the storms in this part of the world have been documented quite heavily in at least fictional media, in things like The Wizard of Oz or Twister or Twisters most recently. It was really cool seeing the footage of the horses running away through the storms. That was really cool. I figured we'd actually talk about the horses a bit. We don't. We just talk about the storms. We talk about wildfires. Now that's good for the regeneration of this grass. And then we focus on bison. It was kind of obvious we were going to talk about bison in the series and in this episode in particular. And I did like how they did talk about how the bison had been decimated in the past, but have since made a recovery because they're protected. And the footage of the bison was all great. But again, like the coyotes, the actual content was nothing I hadn't seen before. Them fighting, it was fine. I like the footage and actually having them in there and how they discussed the bison and generally the history of the bison. It was good, so I really like that. And then they also talk about intensive farming, how this part of America is where most of the produce is grown because conditions are great for agriculture, which of course they are. And it was really haunting as they zoom out and show you how much of the land has actually been basically terraformed into farmland. It's quite sobering, to be honest with you, when you think about how, iconic the Great Plains are. They really aren't there anymore, to be honest with you, at least not in the way they were in the past. As much as the Wild West is romanticised, And this episode does lean into that romanticism a bit. It very much is gone like that. That's been replaced with a much different world. And we end the episode with sandhill cranes. We see them in this little wetland in Nebraska where they're courting, they're mating, and it's fine. Again, it's again nice footage. I like cranes. Cranes are quite nice to look at, so I like that as well. And I think that was quite a good way of ending the episode. So yeah, this episode is good. I think it's the best one so far by quite a reasonable margin for me. The highlights were the rattlesnakes and the ants, but I pretty much liked all the footage at the very least, even if I wasn't that big on the content. But it was still pretty good. And so yeah, what were your thoughts on this episode? What did you like? What did you dislike? What were your highlights? Let me know in the comments below. Next week I'll be doing the next one, whatever it is. Feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next week, and goodbye.